Grand Existence. I'm JD, Nicholas Jensen Denton, the creator of this Pharmacopeia, and today I'd like to talk to you about prospecting for xylazine and opioid plant-based treatment modalities. Now, keep in mind, I am not a licensed physician, doctor, I barely have my bachelor's degree, but I'm a truth seeker. I am in school, I'm coming out with a medicinal plant chemistry bioanalytical degree, and I'm taking all the knowledge that I have, everything that I know, and trying to condense it down into as simple understanding as I can possibly give you so that we can just bring awareness to a problem that faces our entire culture and which is a product of the degradative nature of the capitalist system, this industrial medicinal Western system, which is seemingly blocking our abilities to live a more higher quality of life and even medical treatment. So today I'm really going to talk about heroin overdoses, withdrawals, and specifically heroin that's been laced or cut with xylazine. Now, let's get directly into it. I don't want to waste too much time. Let's just get to the information. So today we're prospecting for xylazine and opioid treatments. Keep in mind, I'm not a licensed physician. I cannot claim to practice any type of medicine. I do not recommend any of these as medicines. Frankly, don't take my advice on anything. I'm just a random stranger on the internet. However, this is everything I know in relation to this subject as an analytical plant chemist, hopefully a future scientist. Like, I've got experiments already, but I ain't got no published papers. Regardless, you don't need to publish scientific literature to know how to treat yourself, to know how to fix your own health and come into a more balanced state of being. And so with all the information available or that's been made available online, I've condensed and allocated and coordinated these slides together to try and be an introduction to the issue that we're facing, how we could go about solving it, and maybe some future outlooks that we can have that would lead us to a more beneficial outcome of this scenario being nationwide, being the opioid epidemic that is absolutely a result of tyrannical organizations targeting susceptible communities and bribing doctors. I can't emphasize how much of a tyrannical and deliberately harmful situation that we're finding ourselves in as a result of this medicinal, capitalist, industrialist society. I've got another blog about kratom specifically, and as an alternative to opioids in treating pain for plant medicine. And I go and talk a lot about the Sackler family, these multiple families that have been flooding our culture with these harmful drugs, and basically creating whatever the opposite of the black market is. This is still a black market. It is the big pharmaceutical ring of individuals who are the world's biggest drug dealers now, and how they're taking over the market, and why it's not really actually about our health or wellness. It's actually more about controlling populations, and is more about selling medicine to get money moving into the right or wrong hands, depending on how you look at it. At any rate, today we are looking specifically at a problem that has arisen out of this culture, which is xylazine, which is the xylazine epidemic. Now, this is what inspired this whole video, so please give this TikTok a watch right here.
All right, public service announcement. I work in treatment in a detox setting, and we are noticing that people coming in off of heroin, or it's not even heroin anymore, off of fentanyl, they are not getting better when we give them the Suboxone. and they're all going into precipitated withdrawal more, and it's just not working because there's another drug that they're putting in off the street. It's called xylazine, and it's a horse tranquilizer, and Subutex, Suboxone, none of it works. So people, they're not getting better when they come to detox, and they're leaving more. It's really scary. So the medical field world or whatever, they have to come up with a new treatment plan because this isn't working. And xylazine is a nasty, nasty drug. It's causing people to lose limbs because of nasty sores and stuff. It's bad. And if something does, all right, public.
I'd like to say thank you to Timmy Noodles for the work you're doing and for putting the word out about this problem and bringing awareness to it. That's the first step in fixing any problem, is talking about it. So today we're going to talk about it. Now, like he said, xylazine, it is a horse tranquilizer drug. It is primarily used for veterinarians. Only a licensed vet can buy and administer these things. It is an unregulated drug. It's unregulated by the FDA, meaning it is abundantly present throughout the entire United States, throughout Central America, and likely overseas. I didn't look too much into overseas, but I'm sure it's out there. Studies done on the heroin supply across the United States have found xylazine to be present pretty much ubiquitously across the entire country. So this isn't good, like he said, because xylazine, usually heroin, well, it's not even heroin anymore, like you said, fentanyl is cut with xylazine so that the street dealers or perhaps big pharma, whoever's making these drugs and allocating it, because they're coming from somewhere, this stuff does not grow out of the ground. It is very synthetic. It is also known as trank dope because it is an intense tranquilizer. It is also known as the zombie drug. And what happens is that it binds agonistically to the alpha 2 adrenergic receptor, which is something we're going to talk about a lot here because that's the key to fixing this whole thing. Xylazine causes wounds that erupt in a scaly dead tissue called eschar. Untreated, they can lead to amputation. It induces a blackout stupor for hours, rendering users vulnerable to all sorts of mistreatment. Xylazine, again, it's a horse tranquilizer similar to ketamine, which did not become regulated until 1999. And ketamine has made a lateral transition from veterinarian use into human use, and now it is being used to treat all sorts of psychological conditions such as PTSD and other trauma-based issues. It is a very powerful psychoactive. However, xylazine is a little bit different. It has all of these side effects, like horrible, horrible side effects. And what it does is it binds agonistically to these adrenaline receptors, which their natural substrates are norepinephrine, epinephrine, a class of compounds called catecholamine compounds. We're going to look at the structures of those, and we're going to look at what makes those unique here in just a second. So this is a sedative, and it is not an opioid. So we have two novel acting agents within this, quote, trank dope that is contributing to the death of people overdosing and addicted to it. And so one thing I'd like to take away from here is that this adrenaline receptor, specifically the alpha 2 type adrenergic receptor, is the one we're looking at. Here we've got alpha 2. There are subtypes of it, at least 4 that we're aware of. I think they were discovered in like 1966 or 99. They have a pretty, they have not, nope, because this is a horse tranquilizer, people have not looked into human clinical trials with it. And so that we don't have accurate data on how this drug is binding to the cells and the receptors within human trials. We have this highlighted portion right here comes from bovine, from cattle and swine, from pigs and cows, and they're very good representatives of human interaction. However, it is not a perfect correlation. There is research indicating variability in the speciation variability in the effects of xylazine. It doesn't affect rats as much as it does affect cows. So there's a lot of piecework that must be done in understanding what's going on with us. I would like to assume that it binds more strongly than this. This 1,570 nanomoles. So this is the Ki. Ki is an indication of how potent an inhibitor is to produce. It is the concentration required to produce half maximum inhibition. So the adrenaline receptors are inhibited at half of what their total inhibition could be with 1,570 nanomoles of xylazine. That's a high amount. The higher your numbers are here, then the lower the affinity for the receptor. Now, again, these are in animal subjects, which could be different from humans, and judging by the widespread effects of xylazine on the population that we're witnessing in real time, I would suggest, and I'm no expert, but I would think that it's actually a higher affinity, meaning a lower Ki than what is being represented here. However, this is the data that we have available and that I have sourced and that we're working with. So we have an incomplete picture. That's what I'm trying to say. Unregulated, abundantly available. It is synergetic with opioids, meaning it is a sedative. It stops the production of adrenaline, and it takes away pain. But then it has, because it's unnatural, it has all sorts of crazy side effects that are detrimental, complete. Like your limbs start falling off. So let me just give us a very brief receptor pharmacology 101 lesson, like world's quickest lesson, because that's how we're going to understand how to fix these from an applied plant medicine perspective, as well as from a pharmaceutical perspective, or if we are creating synthetic medicinal compounds in the lab. What we need to know is that essentially the body is filled with thousands of different types of receptors. Now, this nicotinic receptor, this muscarinic receptor, these are the two main classes of cholinergic receptors. Okay, so they bind acetylcholine, which is an indole-based alkaloid. You can see the structure of the modality, the scaffold, right here. Now, this doesn't mean it's the only substrate that this can bind to, but it is a critical indicator that it will potentially bind to this system or other systems like this. Now, the way receptors work is that they send signals back and forth from cell to cell, from organ to organ, from all across the body. And when these things are activated with an agonist, so every cell and every receptor in your body, you have receptors for things that your body produces, natural compounds, adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine, adrenochrome even. These all activate the receptor to cause their intended effect. However, you can supplant these natural substrates with agonists and antagonists. Now, an agonist mimics the natural substrate, but because it's not the natural substrate, there are some side effects that are not typically experienced in the sober state of consciousness. So if you put an agonist onto the nicotinic receptor, it's going to excite it, causing muscle contraction, stimulating activity. It's going to release adrenaline and dopamine. It's going to increase your blood pressure. But if you put an antagonist on it, it blocks the receptor from working and typically will have an opposite effect of what the natural function is of these receptors. So if you block a nicotinic or muscarinic receptor, it's going to cause dilation at the pupil, increased heart rate. It's going to cause sedation, muscle relaxation, paralysis, whatever the opposite is. If it's something that is like waking you up, it'll put you out. If it's something that is deregulating another receptor, then it'll upregulate it. So you see, it's a very simple binary action of these receptors and of what their substrates are. Now, again, multiple different kinds of substrates can bind multiple different kinds of receptors, and we'll look at that here right now. But I just wanted to lay down the groundwork for how, pharmacologically speaking, our body's working, because this is the key to how we're going to negate these unnatural. This is how we're going to be able to reverse engineer the unnatural interaction between our biology and these synthetic compounds. Now, on the left here, you see a neuron, a part of the central nervous system, and its normal functioning here. You have these little triangles are norepinephrine. Essentially, what's happening here is that norepinephrine is produced in the presynaptic neuron and released into the synapse, and it will bind to the alpha-1 adrenergic receptor here, and then it will produce alert. It will in a normal physiology produce alertness, regulate your blood pressure and your heart rate, and then when too much norepinephrine or whichever substrate begins to flood the synapse, it will initiate a negative feedback loop where it binds the secondary receptor, which is the key receptor we're looking at here, to shut off the production of the natural substrate, thus leading to the lack of adrenaline and shutting down the alertness, reducing the blood pressure, slowing the heart rate. Okay, and so what happens when you shoot up some heroin which has xylazine in it? It's going to mimic that norepinephrine, and it's going to bind with this alpha-2 adrenergic receptor. And what happens is that it begins to shut down the adrenaline, and that's where your sedation comes in. Excessive inhibition of sympathetic outflow causes sedation, okay? So it will do the same thing that an overflow of norepinephrine would do, but because this is not physiologically, metabolically initiated, it's initiated off of the drug addict's actions, and because of these being highly synthetic, unnatural, they've got strange pharmacological properties. Look, here is the structure of xylazine. When they get in there, they shut down the adrenaline, but then they have a litany of side effects, which we saw earlier, which includes the skin cells dying and lesions appearing, ultimately leading to amputations in extreme cases, and also intense sedation, like to the point where it outlasts the fentanyl, which is 50 or 100 times more powerful than standard regular morphine. And so it leaves people in a drunken stupor despite their opioid addiction being, despite an opioid addiction being treated. They can still be experiencing the effects of the xylazine, which is actually arguably far worse than simple morphine. So the receptor system here, again, the adrenergic receptor system, it consists of 4 different subtypes. Well, 3 subtypes and the main type, the alpha 1 receptor, and they're activated again by this class of compounds called catecholamines. Catecholamines. I say it different every time. I'm sorry. They these here are the main catecholamines that your body is producing endogenously. That's adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine, and you can see that it also binds to imidazole, imidazoline, sorry, imidazoline alkaloids. And these can often be found bound to a carbon ring, a 6-membered ring, and to form this indole alkaloid, which is found to have a very, very high affinity for these receptors over here. So it's not just these, it's not just this, it's not this, it's different combinations of all of these come together in novel ways. Every single little tiny different alteration to these core structures can produce a different side effect or a different major effect. And like, look at just the difference here between norepinephrine and dopamine, which are two totally, completely different, phenomenologically obvious experiences. It's just an oxygen and a hydrogen. That's it. You remove that alcohol group, and then it becomes dopamine. So you can see here how much variability there can be in the interplay between these receptors. And I think it's really important to point out that the precursor to all of these endogenous compounds is the amino acid tyrosine. Now, there is a sentiment within many different medicinal modalities in the world that states that really your body can heal itself if you provide it with the right type of raw organic material. The body knows what it needs to do to fix itself. And so if you are not getting enough tyrosine, which is an amino acid, then that could exacerbate the effects of the xylazine. So I can't recommend enough a well-balanced diet as the first boundary to your health and wellness. Now, we've talked a lot about xylazine, its withdrawals, its overdoses, it's untreatable. There is no medical protocol yet for managing it. There's a Dr. D'Orazio, I don't know, I've never met him. I read about him a little bit. He typically uses anti-anxiety drugs. These are synthetic pharmaceutically available compounds, which I'm going to list off a couple here in a second, which bind to these receptors. But notice he's saying it is to treat the patient's symptoms. And we can literally, I just want to say that we can literally treat symptoms for decades, forever, before we treat the actual source of the disease. If you treat the symptom forever, a person is never going to get healthy again. And so that's why I bring up the amino acid tyrosine, and like we need to think more big picture, more top down for this in order to really cut this problem off at the root of what it is. Like they say it's untreatable, I say it's only untreatable when the source is not addressed. Okay? A lot of people have given up hope. Philadelphia, there's some towns in there where people just move there because that's where the heroin is. More than 90% of Philadelphia's lab tested dope samples tested positive for xylazine, according to recent data. 36 states and the District of Columbia found xylazine in 25% of drug samples. So this stuff is spreading, and it's spreading because it's cheaper. If you can cut it, people have been cutting drugs for a long time to make their make higher profits. Big Pharma does it. I mean, they don't cut them; they just jack the prices up exorbitantly high. But street dealers will cut things, and you need to be aware of this. Like chemists in their in their garages or wherever people are making this. Anybody can be a chemist and make this stuff, but if it's not what you're supposed to be doing, if you're doing it to take drugs, then it's not something that is going to be condoned by society. And so obviously we need to be a little bit more concerned with the rise of xylazine throughout the extended United States. Reversing an overdose is tricky. The overdose halting medicine naloxone blocks and reverses opioids' effects on the brain receptors. It will address the fentanyl or the morphine, but it still will not rouse a victim sedated with xylazine. Desperate rescuers have tried second and third doses, but too much xylazine likewise can put someone into withdrawal, vomiting, and writhing. The trank dope literally eats your flesh. It's self-destruction at its finest. So what have been the treatment efforts so far? And also I'd like to point out that this is an interesting graph right here because it shows with the rise in xylazine overdose incidents, we are finding likewise a almost mirrored decrease with benzodiazepine related overdose incidents. And so that could be saying that again, if we don't treat the source of this, we can eliminate xylazine, but the benzo incident ratio will shoot right back up. So it's not a matter of this drug is the problem or that drug is the problem. Identifying individual drugs is a major key in moving things in the right direction, but really this is a psychological ailment which individuals face. Addiction is psychological, it's not physical. It's not physical, it's all psychological. And once you can begin to fix your own psyche again, then you can fix yourself. You can fix yourself. You don't need any drugs. But at any rate, we're going to talk about the drugs and the management of xylazine overdose. This is all about field management. Not really going to talk about that here. These photos were sourced from Dr. D'Orazio. He talks about yohimbine and atipamezole and naloxone. We talked a little bit about already. Yohimbine is a compound right here. I believe it's a triterpenoid that comes from the yohimbe tree, an evergreen that is traditionally used in South African medicines, and it is known as a selective alpha-2 adrenergic receptor antagonist. Yohimbine is used, and it's pretty prevalent in the literature as this alpha-2 adrenergic receptor, and they often use it to test the effects of other compounds on the adrenergic receptor. However, I bring this up because it's not really recommended because it comes with all these intense side effects, gastrointestinal distress, increased blood pressure, anxiety. And likewise, when they tested these on sheep, they discovered that the yohimbine can be used as an antagonist to control the duration of xylazine-induced respiratory depression, although the degree of reversal was less than clinically desirable. Now, this could just be a dosage problem here. I wrote here, can we engineer it out? Because oftentimes we can engineer out side effects by manipulating the structures of the molecules. I think there was something else I wanted to say back here. It's an antagonist, right? So all of these that have been suggested, well, these two are antagonists, and those are the first two I wanted to talk about because you should do it underneath the healthcare of a professional. If you're gonna, underneath the guidance of a healthcare professional, if you're going to, I'm not going to recommend it because it seems like everybody says that it's not something that they recommend. Although it is something that everybody looks at because it is a very prevalent drug which is used to act on these specific receptors. Now, he also mentioned atipamezole, which is a synthetic drug, a synthetic compound created again as a horse tranquilizer used by veterinarians, but it is a strong antagonist, meaning it shuts off the receptor of specifically the alpha 2 adrenergic receptor. And so it can be used. I'm going to tell you right now, if I was overdosing on xylazine and you had some atipamezole, give it to me. If you don't, I'm going to get into other potential drugs that could work in place of this, but only veterinarians can buy this. It's mainly only used for dogs, but it is specifically used to reverse the effects of xylazine. And so we have something available already that is not made for humans. But again, just because things aren't made for humans doesn't mean they can't be used in humans. Ketamine is a fine example. And this is within the veterinary practice. Atipamezole is the highest binding. It has the highest affinity for alpha 2 over the alpha 1 receptor. So it's specific to the subtype number 2, which is really good. That's exactly what we need. However, it's synthetic, and these synthetic drugs seem to be causing more problems than they are solutions. At any rate, there are... Oh, also, I'd like to point out that although it's a horse drug, they have looked at it for anti-Parkinson effects to reduce the adverse cardiovascular effects of the dopaminergic drugs in rats. So it's been used to test how it could be potentially used in humans, but this is one study. I couldn't find any others in the literature. If you do, please send them my way. At any rate, this right here again is this atipamezole utilizes both the indole. Well, this is not an indole, but this is a structure that has high affinity for the receptor. However, it is this one here is the imadazoline receptor agonist that is really binding to it strongly. And this is the critical indicator here for these other drugs as well: moxonidine, rilmenidine, colonidine, dexmedetomidine, mivazorol. Many of those are synthetic anti-anxiety drugs. These are listed in order of potency, in order of preference for the imadazoline receptor, which is again the adrenergic 2. Moxonidine and rilmidine, these top 2 right here are in clinical practice. I don't know how to get a hold of any of them. I don't know who to talk to do it. However, there's a link down here if you want to get atipamezole. That's kind of that he brought that up, and I just figured we should address that because it does what we need it to do. It is an agonist of, it is an antagonist. These are agonists. Atipamezole is an antagonist, meaning it shuts off the receptor. So this is something that could be explored. Absolutely. Again, if I was overdosing and you had the atipam, give it to me. But since those are not really recommended by practicing doctors, I would like to look at how the current treatments are working already and wonder if we can, instead of looking at antagonists which deactivate the receptor, is it possible to find an agonist, which is the same thing? Like, look at Narcan. Narcan is an opioid. It's an agonist. It has a higher binding affinity for the opioid receptors than fentanyl or morphine, and therefore it kicks them out of their position at a fairly rapid onset and averts the overdose. Now, it's important, I'm sure if you're familiar with Narcan, you already know, but if you don't, its active ingredient, naloxone, agonistic of opioid receptors, binds with higher affinity so that it binds to it. You're still on opioids, but the difference is, like I've been saying, every different structural conformation has different side effects. It just so happens that with fentanyl and morphine, one of those side effects is shutting off your lungs, like slowing your breathing so low that it stops and then you die. That's how overdoses happen, because it suffocates you. So in order to stop the suffocation, a different drug, naloxone, is injected into the cells so that your cells can bind with those instead and avert the pulmonary failure. So it's important to note that this is not treating the addiction, this is only averting the overdose. And it's not a foolproof, this isn't a foolproof solution here either for opioid addiction. And it has zero effect on the xylazine issue, but I'm looking at the agonistic activity here. And if we can employ the same principle with the other one, with xylazine. And so if we were to do that, I would say absolutely the first plant, the first source of potential agonistic compounds on opioids that we should look at is kratom, otherwise known as Mitragyna speciosa. I think for sure kratom, it is going to be our greatest ally in this opioid war against big pharma, because this is a plant that naturally produces a wide array of opioid and adrenergic binding compounds. In addition to opioid receptors, the adrenergic neurotransmitter system is another major pharmacological target of kratom in treating pain and opioid withdrawal symptoms. So this plant can serve as a pool of potential therapeutic agents of which we can begin to extract, replicate, and provide on a clinical basis to these treatment facilities. This was one of the first studies done, November 2021, of 2 years ago. Information on the specific binding of mitragynine or other kratom alkaloids to various subtypes of alpha 1 and alpha 2 adrenergic receptors is still lacking. So as a result, they looked into that's exactly what they looked into in this study. The affinities of mitragynine, the main specialized metabolite, and other indole-based kratom alkaloids, speciogynine, 7-hydroxy, specioatine, all of these and their affinities and activities at the adrenergic receptors. Mitragynine was found to have moderate non-selective binding activities at affinity at all of the adrenergic receptors with a low micromolar Ki, meaning the lower the Ki, the higher the affinity, the less it takes to overtake the receptor, the less plant material it's going to take to overtake the receptor. The binding affinity of both mitragynine diastereomers varied at the alpha 2 subtype. Speciogynine displayed non-selective binding affinities. So speciogynine was another very strong candidate for adrenergic receptor binding. This is, so you understand what I'm saying, these individual compounds can all be used individually or as a whole to begin to overtake the xylazine withdrawals, specifically the xylazine withdrawal. However, kratom will likewise, complementary to the adrenergic transmitter system, will also bind opioid receptors. So it's a very, very powerful tool in treating opioid addiction and overdose, I do believe. Specifically here, they've broken down the exact binding affinities of different metabolites within kratom on different receptors. Here I've got highlighted the receptor in question, the adrenergic alpha 2. You can see here that this is a chart of the percent displacement of the bound radioligand. So corinanthidine at 10,000 nanomolar concentrations, it displaces 95.1% of the receptor. That is a highly, highly effective agonist to the very key receptor right here. I think doctors, somebody who's got power to administer medicines to people on a mass scale needs to look into this specific molecule, corinanthidine. Further, you come over here, mitragynine, the number one most prevalent molecule in kratom, 40% at 10,000 moles, 10,000 nanomoles. And then again, speciosiliatine, 73% at 10,000 nanomoles concentration. So we've got three key candidates right here, just within one leaf, that could absolutely attend to the xylazine poisoning. Okay, so this is what I think is the main key here to this epidemic, is these three compounds either used as a whole plant medicine or as fractions of the plant medicine or even as isolates. Somebody needs to get in here and start and apply this knowledge in a medical scale. I am not a doctor. Again, I can't recommend any treatments, but if I were overdosing on heroin cut with xylazine, you are goddamn right, I'm going to make some kratom tea and see if that helps. Beyond kratom itself, there are a litany of other plants which act as agonists of the alpha-2 receptors. Acorus calamus, sweet flag. This one right here has been used since ancient Egyptian times. It's got some psychoactive properties to it. It's sedating, it's calming, it's used in Ayurveda and the TCM. It has a compound, ozerone, exhibits high affinity for alpha-2 adrenergic receptors. This is what we want, something that exhibits a higher affinity. If it's an agonist, it needs to exhibit a higher affinity for the alpha-2 receptors than does the xylazine. Now, we don't know exactly what the concentration of xylazine is, or the binding affinity, which is also known as the KD. I think that'll be here in a second. We need to get these are like plant-based versions of naloxone, of Narcan. If you have motherwort, Leonurus cardiaca, motherwort, traditionally used as a sedative, treats anxiety. Like that other doctor was saying, he uses anxiety medications to treat xylazine withdrawal. Any plant, I'm not going to say any plant because they all have different mechanisms of action, but this motherwort works on the adrenergic receptor system, and it has affinity for the alpha-2 subtype. Valerian also has affinity. Valinerol and valerenol and valerianic acid. These are two different compounds naturally occurring in valerian. Another one that I found that could be especially useful is with Annea somnifera. Now, I didn't find any evidence suggesting that it bound to the alpha 2 with selectivity or specific affinity for the subtype alpha 2, but it does affect the entire adrenergic receptor system. And so it should be considered. However, these top 3 right here are similar to kratom. They contain potentially therapeutic compounds which could be useful in the antidote formula of xylazine poisoning. So here I've done a little bit of research to find the specific binding affinities of those active compounds withholding withanolides. There was evidence suggesting the withanolide class of compounds, which are present in Withania somnifera, have a high affinity for the adrenergic receptors. However, I could only find that they were on the beta receptors. I didn't see anything specifically about the alpha 2. Now, this could be simply because of lack of research, I was looking in the wrong place, or what have you. This is still a potential therapeutically potential. This is still a compound that has potential therapeutic applications towards it because it acts on the collective system. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Again, you can see here this chart posted from the first slide, which highlights the molar concentrations of xylazine. So if these numbers here, the smaller the number, the better. The closer you can get to 0, you won't get to 0 because that's an absolute, but if you get 0.3 nanomoles of azarone in cattle, at least, it would absolutely outcompete xylazine in the alpha 2 system. And so that needs to be looked into. These are all readily available, growing in our environment. I guarantee you pass by these plants when you walk around on the street. The only reason we're not using plant-based modalities is because of a bunch of rich people got together and decided they're going to keep the rich people rich and the poor people poor by taking the power out of their hands to be able to know themselves well enough to heal themselves and treat themselves. And so drug-based modality was made the norm by an authoritative tyrannical force about 120 years ago now, and we're still living in the effects of it. However, if we look to somewhere like China or Japan, Taiwan, even the European Pharmacopeia talks a lot about whole plant medicines as whole plant material as active medicines, whereas in the American Pharmacopeia, the United States Pharmacopeia, we only are concerned with individual drugs. However, this can be potentially problematic because, as we know, like with the withanolides, there is a synergy between the collective constituents of a single plant, which have an overall greater effect than any single individual withanolide. And so perhaps this is why we couldn't find any evidence, because they are testing individual compounds that have lower affinity, lower bioavailability when they're not present with the other compounds. I can't be too sure. There's a lot of research out there, and I implore you all to do your own research so that we can find more compounds that are potentially useful for this pandemic we're facing, which, again, to me is a war. This is a war against demonic forces. So further, that's just an article talking about azarone, stachytine hydrochloride from the this is it's found in Yimyu cow, a traditional Chinese medicine, also found in motherwort. Notice the same genus. Where does it say? The main active component can inhibit norepinephrine. Okay, that's the same neurotransmitters that are concerned with the adrenaline system, that are concerned with the xylazine binding. Again, over here, we've got another plant that I didn't show specifically, Cresta Marti. I've never even heard of this plant. It's just something that I came along in my research where they were testing the gastroprotective effects in mice, and they found that the activity is mediated specifically by alpha 2 adrenoreceptor activation, so agonist. This is an agonist of the receptor system, and that could be potentially useful. If it is a strong enough agonist, or perhaps it could be combined with other agonists, we could potentially have a new modality to look. And I have to try to stay away from the word treat because I don't want somebody with unjust authority coming at me for talking about treating people with plants without having the proper licensings and stuff. But fuck these assholes for making these laws which make it impossible for us to talk about ourselves and understand our own health and wellness and take charge of our bodies. Frankly, I don't fucking care anymore. I've had too many friends die, and if you've been affected, I am sorry for you. I send you my infinite love and wholeness because, not because, I do, because this is something that we all face. Like, who hasn't been affected at this point? Now, again, we have been talking about agonists this whole time. I'm going to change gears a little bit to antagonists. That would be plants that would shut down the activity of these receptors. This is just going in a slightly different direction because we were looking at employing the same principle of the Narcan, and except with xylazine pharmacology. Now we're going to look at antagonists, which are the opposite. It's the shutting down of the receptor. We've got 4 plants here which are antagonistic to the alpha 2 adrenergic receptors. I can't even pronounce this one. Rauwolfia serpentina, Paganum harmala, this is Syrian rue, Erythrina malungu, cat's claw, Uncaria tomentosa, native to the rainforest, traditionally used in indigenous medicine for anti-inflammatory, anti-immunomodulatory properties. There are certain active compounds that act as the alpha-2 adrenergic receptor antagonists. Now, it's important to point out that plants are a complex mixture of naturally occurring compounds. Sometimes the most abundant one is the most metabolically active one. Sometimes a less abundant metabolite is actually the one. And so a whole plant extract is not always going to work. Please, plant chemists, if we dissect these enough and we are able to concentrate the lesser abundant molecules into an antidote, then they could have a better effect. This is just things that need to be studied more and need to be tested more and need to be looked into more by anybody or everybody who thinks that they could have an effect on this situation that we're in. Erythrina malungu. I could not find a lot of research on malunguine. So yeah, these are antagonists. These plants will shut off to a relative degree the adrenergic receptor system. They need to be looked at. Somebody look at them. We've got Withania somnifera. Now, I brought this up earlier because it doesn't have the. Well, what does it say here? Okay, they looked at they characterized which receptors were involved in the effects of Withania somnifera, and these are all the receptors that they looked at here. Sorry. And they found that it's not selective to the alpha 2 receptor. However, it did prolong the pain relieving effects of morphine induced the Withania somnifera extract prolonged the morphine-induced analgesia and suppressed the development of morphine-induced rebound hyperalgesia, probably through the involvement of one of these. They know that it has a particular effect. They don't know the actual mechanism, so we can't say for sure that Withania somnifera can attenuate the xylazine treatment. However, we can know definitively that it can be a very useful tool in the treatment of addiction, which is a big part of these outreach centers, these programs which are treating these overdoses, and especially in places like Philadelphia and Chicago and all over California, Florida. These modalities, these healing therapies, these plant-based medicines have a lot of overlooked potential simply because people are not aware even of where medicine comes from. Most doctors have zero clue about the chemistry or the origins of their synthetic drugs. They have zero clue about the healing power of nature. So it's important. It's really important to me to put this natural, organic, readily available, cheap, and powerful medicines out there into the public awareness for you all to see, do your own research, come to your own conclusions, and do what you need to do to save your people. Further prospects, these are just two other plants that I came across in my research. Chlorophytum alismifolium, Bombax costatum. I've never heard of these plants before in my life. They have affinity. This one is a possible involvement of the adrenergic receptor. However, it absolutely has anti-nociceptive activity. It could be through a different mechanism. It has effects on the adrenergic receptors, and this is something that should be considered in potential more further research, more further prospecting. Likewise, the Bombax costatum may involve alpha-2 adrenergic receptor, opioidergic, and arachidonic pathways. Could be of clinical benefits if studied on man. Whoever's watching this, I'm just a student right now, so I don't have the capacity to apply for grants or whatever. If you're out there listening, this is my findings. What have you found? Another interesting one. This is Dipsacus asper. This is a tree. I forget where it grows exactly. I think this is an evergreen tree. It produces a compound, not any of these, but it produces more than 100 compounds, all of which have substantial medicinal effect, biological protective effects against bone fracture, anti-osteoporosis. They have neuroprotective qualities, cardioprotective qualities, and anti-aging qualities, and it protects the reproductive systems. I can't express how important, how paramount that is to the survival of our species. There is a very specific compound, Dipsacus saponin C, when administered intrathecally, which I believe means into the spine. It acts as an agonist, anti-nociceptive effect when administered spinally, and GABA B, and alpha-2 adrenergic and serotonin receptors located at the spinal cord level, but not opioid receptors, may be involved in DSC-induced anti-nociception. So this could be a potential Narcan-like substance to use as an emergency protocol, potentially to deactivate the receptors. to activate the receptors. This is an agonist. So further research. This is that compound, that DSC right there. It's a triterpenoid, which means it has a lot of repeating units of the same thing. Typically, the more complex these molecules are, the more complex their biological actions are, which requires more research, more understanding before applying in a methodological manner. So what we're looking at here basically is how we can begin to prospect further, look at more specialized plant metabolites, or generating more synthetic compounds, or using these medicinal natural compounds as scaffolds to create new drugs. This comes from an article on the receptor pharmacology of the adrenergic system, and what they found was that the ring D of osmolysine and tetrahydroalstanine are the critical characteristics. What they're talking about right here is this compound. This part of the structure is the critical binding component to the receptor that you need, which likewise has a part of this imidazole in it. And so if we can focus and hone in on these indole-based scaffolds, then there is not lost hope. We can absolutely come to a solution for this problem. If we just get enough eyes on this and we get enough experimental research going on into the major kratom alkaloids, into DSC, into some of even these pre-existing veterinarian drugs, we can definitely fix this problem. So you can see how all of these modalities are present. This one is kind of crazy. I don't know where exactly the imidazole scaffold is. This is the indole-based alkaloid again. We need to look more at this problem. Selected indole-based kratom alkaloids were evaluated for their opioid adrenergic receptor binding, mitragynine, higher affinity opioid receptors than at adrenergic receptors, while the vice versa was observed for corinanthidine. The observed polypharmacology of kratom alkaloids may support its utilization to treat opioid use disorder and withdrawal. So polypharmacy, again, is an entourage, a synergistic effect between multiple different pharmacological agents having a more expressive, just a different pharmacological action than a simple single one of them. Particularly important here. Let's see. There's one other study I wanted to look at. So I've been trying to point out a bunch of potential agents which will absolutely be key players in the discovery of a new compound to treat the xylazine withdrawal. However, in terms of opioid dependence and withdrawal syndrome in general, maybe not necessarily just the overdose, but in continued treatment of opioid dependence from fentanyl, from xylazine, morphine, and their withdrawal, I would like to bring to your attention this review article, which I actually have over here somewhere. We can take a quick peek at a review of different medicinal plants which have been used, scientifically studied, and clinically acknowledged for their ability to treat opioid tolerance, dependence, and withdrawal. Bacopa, Monaria. This is an outstanding plant. I have this in my pharmacopeia right now. Modulates adenyl cyclase activation by opioid receptors. Extract has calcium 2 channel blocking activity. There is pain relieving anticholinergic activity, and the ethanolic extract of bacopa monterey showed inhibitory effects on analgesic tolerance, withdrawal signs, and reversed tolerance to morphine. That's very promising. Now, there's a lot of plants in here. I think there's 30 exactly that they discuss. Delphinium, denudatum, marubium vulgare, matricaria, camellia. These can all be ascertained readily from the environment or from a herbal plant medicine dealer, and can be prepared into different kinds of extractions. That's what these charts here will show you, and they will assist this opioid epidemic we're experiencing here. If you come to these tables, they have the plant name. You have to turn your head sideways. They've got the type of extract, whether it's an essential oil extract, an alcohol, the methods used to create them, the tested doses, the possible or actual mechanisms, and the active ingredients, and then the source where you can go read more about it. Please check this article out if you are looking for alternative means of treating your victims. Can't recommend it enough. The source, if you just type in the name of this article into Google, it should pop right up. Maybe type in phytotherapy research as well. But yes, that is everything I've been able to put together in the past 48 hours. Again, let's just recap here. Xylazine, horse tranquilizer, synthetic drug, unregulated, present in in a majority of the drugs in a majority of the United States, probably beyond too. Xylazine binds to the alpha-2 adrenaline receptors. In order to get it off of the adrenaline receptor, you either need an antagonist to deactivate the receptor or an agonist that mimics the natural substrate to outcompete the synthetic alternative, in which case you would find something like this happening and return to normal functioning of the receptors. Likewise, the tyrosine precursor is essential in maintaining homeostatic balance so that you can have the correct endogenous ratios of adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine, so that you can return to a state of normal life more effectively. So definitely find a rich source of an organic diet so that you can implement your food as your medicine. Again, let's make sure that would treat the source of a lot of these problems. Let's not just look at the symptoms, even though we should be obviously aware of the symptoms. They are absolutely, they're just rattling. Like if you've ever seen a person with giant black spots all over their hands because they've been shooting up, their arms are dead but still attached, like it's fucked. It's completely fucked up. Despite popular belief, it's not untreatable. Persevere your mental willpower, because where there's a will, there is a way. Again, we can't just treat the symptoms because another devil will take its place. We have to go to the source. However, at an attempt at treating the symptoms, yohimbine has been looked at. It's not recommended. Atipamezole has been looked at. It has been used. It has not been approved for human use. One thing we should note is that it takes about $1 to $20 billion to put a new drug into a doctor's hands. And frankly, there's just not enough push to have this clinically studied. So they're not going to put it on the stores or into the hands of doctors. They frankly just don't fucking care, which makes sense because these are the dudes that make the rules that allow this kind of see, I really use the word tyranny a lot. This is the rules. These people put rules in place that benefit them, and unfortunately, these leaders are trying to enslave us and take advantage of us. And so this is why we're in the situation that we are. Can we mimic Narcan in an attempt to cure the xylazine overdose? If we were to do it, this is a great place to start right here with these three alkaloids, which could likewise act like naloxone, but on the adrenaline system. And further research could be done into other plant medicines that contain potential adrenergic receptor binding metabolites, such as these agonistic plants with these affinities. Or we could also look at antagonists, which I think is an equally viable option here. And then once we avert the overdoses, we should also look at the treatment of such things. How can we treat it with more non-invasive, more effective, more natural means that bring us into a better quality of living without having to put money into the hands of the people who did this to us in the first place? Again, another novel agent, the Dipsacus asper. Anybody out there that's got better ideas than me, speak up, say something. Let's work together. And again, do your own research on phytotherapy, because there absolutely are alternative options to the Western mainstream look at these, which is frankly, in my opinion, riddled with like guilt and shame and non-acceptance of addicts and that kind of behavior. But to me, that is a faulty way of looking at this. You know, the Buddha said everybody would do what you did if everybody would do what somebody else did if you were born in their shoes. So have some sympathy, because maybe one day you could be, but in a slightly different situation. And so there we go. A total of 35 plant species were studied on the subject. Go read about that if you feel like you need some extra assistance in the on the front line. So thank you very much for coming to my presentation. I hope that was within the time bounds and that we are all benefiting from this. Thank you very much, Nicholas Jensen Denton. Have a grand existence. Persevere through this war. We will come out on top. God will reign back again on this planet. Health will reign back again. The sovereign human, which has power over his own agency, which has agency over his own body, which has supreme authority over our own selves. This will be a reality again in our world. The tyrants will be taken out of control. Those who profit off of our sickness and misfortune will be held accountable with divine justice. It's just a matter of time. However, if you currently have the power to make a change, if you have the will to make a change, I say do it.